Mike Johnson didn't need to shout to end Ilhan Omar's 7-year political winning streak. He only needed to read her the very oath she swore to uphold. When the Speaker of the House stood at the podium and opened a manila folder containing 7 years of Ilhan Omar's congressional conduct, he didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to, because every word he read was something she had sworn, under oath, not to do. Ilhan Omar had laughed 3 times during the censure proceedings. The first was when the resolution was read aloud, a short, dismissive exhale through her nose. The kind of laugh that communicates contempt without requiring a single word. She had been in the chamber for 7 years, and in those 7 years she had developed an instinct for reducing institutional proceedings to their political function. Resolutions were not accountability mechanisms to her. They were content. They were fundraising triggers. They were the raw material from which her communications team would build the next cycle of outrage, victimhood, and survival. The second laugh came when a Republican member cited her pattern of conduct, a phrase she had heard so many times that it had lost its meaning. The way a word, repeated too often, dissolves into sound without sense. She turned to the colleague seated next to her, Rashida, and whispered something that made them both smile. A C-SPAN camera caught the exchange, 2 women sharing a private joke during their own institutional prosecution. The image would be screenshotted, captioned, and shared by both sides, by supporters as evidence of strength, by critics as evidence of contempt. The third laugh, the one that would be replayed in every analysis of what happened next, came when the Speaker of the House set down the gavel and picked up a folder. She laughed because she recognized the choreography. She had been through censure proceedings before. In the 118th Congress, in the 119th, she had been removed from one committee and placed on others. She had weathered FEC complaints that went nowhere, ethics referrals that stalled, presidential press conferences designed to ruin her, and primary challengers who raised money on her controversies but couldn't raise enough votes to defeat her. She had survived because survival was her particular genius. Not policy, not legislation, not coalition building, but the ability to absorb institutional blows and convert them through a precise alchemy of media savvy and identity politics into the very fuel that sustained her career. She had been called prejudiced and survived. She had been called un-American and survived. She had described the September 11th tragedy as some people did something and survived. She had mocked the grieving family of a man whose life was violently taken and survived. Each time, the mechanics were the same. The attack came. The base rallied. The fundraising emails went out. The progressive media defended her, and the institutional action, whatever it was, dissolved into the next news cycle like sugar in water. She would not survive this, not because the charges were different. They were, in most respects, the same charges, accumulated and compounded across 7 years, but because the person delivering them was different from anyone who had tried before. Donald Trump had attacked her with spectacle, entertaining, chaotic, easily dismissed as partisan warfare. The press had attacked her with questions, uncomfortable, but manageable through the standard toolkit of deflection and reframing. Her Republican colleagues had attacked her with resolutions, filed, debated, and forgotten within a week. Mike Johnson attacked her with the oath she had sworn on her first day. And the oath, unlike a tweet, or a press conference, or a resolution, belongs to no party. It belongs to the institution. And the institution, on this particular afternoon, had decided to stop laughing along. The chamber fell quiet at 2:14 p.m. Not the gradual quiet of members finding their seats, but the sudden quiet that occurs when the Speaker sets down the gavel and picks up a folder. In the House of Representatives, Gavels mean procedure. Folders mean evidence. The chamber knew the difference. Johnson stood at the Speaker's podium, a position he had held for less than 3 years, which was long enough to understand its power, and short enough to still feel its weight. He was not a man who commanded rooms through charisma. He commanded them through preparation. In 20 years as a constitutional lawyer, he had learned that the most devastating argument is the one that requires no emphasis, that sits on the page and speaks for itself. The way a statute speaks for itself, the way an oath speaks for itself. Members of this body, he began. His voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man reading a legal brief, rather than delivering a political speech. I am not here today to give a political address. I am here to read a record, specifically the record of a member of this House whose conduct documented, public, repeated across 7 years, and 5 separate institutional actions, raises a question that this institution can no longer defer. He opened the folder. The question is whether the oath she swore on her first day in this chamber has been honored or abandoned. This is not about ideology. This is not about party. This is not about religion or identity or any of the categories that have been used by various parties for various purposes to shield this record from scrutiny. This is about the oath. I want to begin with history, not distant history. This chamber's history, the history of this body's response to the conduct of one specific member across 7 consecutive years. He turned to the first tabbed section of his folder. In 2019, this House passed a resolution condemning discriminatory rhetoric. It was prompted by the remarks of the representative from Minnesota's 5th District, who stated on Twitter publicly that American support for Israel was, quote, all about the Benjamins. Baby. She subsequently named AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, as the source of what she characterized as purchased political loyalty. The implication that Jewish Americans and their organizations buy political support through money was recognized by members of both parties as an intolerant trope. The Democratic leadership Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Hoyer, Whip Clyburn issued a joint statement condemning the remarks. The member apologized. We believed the matter was resolved. He turned a page. 3 weeks after her apology, the same member stated at a public event that she wanted to discuss the political influence in this country that says it is okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country. The accusation of dual loyalty, that Jewish Americans are more loyal to Israel than to the United States, has been characterized by the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and historians as one of the oldest and most dangerous tropes in the history of prejudiced rhetoric. In 2023, this House voted to remove the representative from the Foreign Affairs Committee. The vote was 218 to 211. Multiple Democratic members expressed private concern about the pattern of remarks, even as they voted along party lines. In 2025, Congresswoman Nancy Mace introduced a resolution to censure the representative and strip her of all committee assignments. This followed remarks on a public podcast in which the representative demeaned the memory of Charlie Kirk following his tragic passing, belittled his grieving family, and, in the assessment of multiple members of this body, suggested that Mr. Kirk bore responsibility for his own demise. The representative subsequently reposted the interview on her personal social media accounts. In the same year, Congressman Mike Flood filed a formal Ethics Committee complaint, citing a pattern of conduct and speech that he argued violated Clause 1 of Rule 23 of the Official Code of Conduct. In 2026, this resolution, H. Res. 713, was introduced, calling for censure and removal from the Committee on Education and the Workforce and the Committee on the Budget. He set the page down. Members, I have now enumerated 6 separate institutional actions, resolutions, removals, ethics referrals, and censure proceedings, spanning 7 consecutive years, prompted by the conduct of a single member, 6 in 7 years. I want to say something about what that number means. In the 119 Congresses that have convened since 1789, 237 years of institutional history, the number of members who have prompted 6 separate institutional actions for conduct violations is vanishingly small. It is a distinction no member should aspire to, and yet the member remains. She remains on committees. She remains in her seat. She remains, I would argue, because this institution has treated each incident as isolated, as a single breach requiring a single response, rather than recognizing what the accumulation reveals: a pattern. And patterns, members, require pattern-level responses. Johnson turned to the second tab. His voice did not change. It maintained the same measured cadence, the same constitutional lawyer-esque rhythm. Each sentence constructed the way a legal brief is constructed: premise, evidence, conclusion, and a pause that functions as a period. Clause 1 of Rule 23 of the Official Code of Conduct of the House of Representatives states, and I want every member to hear the exact language: a member, delegate, resident commissioner, officer, or employee of the House shall behave at all times in a manner that shall reflect creditably on the House of Representatives. He looked up from the folder. At all times. I want to emphasize those 3 words, because they carry the entire weight of the standard. Not at most times. Not when it is convenient. Not when the audience is sympathetic and the cameras are on, and the political calculation favors restraint at all times. That is the standard every member of this body agreed to. It is not aspirational language. It is not a suggestion. It is an obligation, voluntarily assumed, binding in conscience, and enforceable by this institution. I want to examine 2 specific instances, separated by 6 years, in which the representative's public statements failed this standard. I want to examine them carefully, because precision matters, and because the representative has argued, in both cases, that her words were taken out of context. I take that argument seriously. Context matters, but so does effect. The first, March 23, 2019. At a banquet hosted by the Council on American Islamic Relations in Woodland Hills, California, the representative delivered a 20-minute speech about the discrimination faced by Muslim Americans. The speech contained many points with which I agree. Discrimination against any American on the basis of religion is wrong, and Muslim Americans were unfairly targeted after September 11th. Those are facts, and I acknowledge them. In the course of that speech, the representative said the following care was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. He paused. Let the words exist in the chamber without commentary. The representative has stated that this phrase was about the aftermath of 9/11, not about the tragedy itself. I have read the full transcript. I accept that the broader context of the speech was about post-9/11 discrimination. I will not argue that the representative intended to minimize the events. But members, intent is not the only measure of language. Effect is also a measure. And when a sitting member of the United States Congress, a member who votes on defense appropriations, who serves on committees that address national security, who speaks in official capacity on behalf of the People's House, describes the loss of 2,977 American citizens with the phrase, "Some people did something," the effect is minimization. The effect is that the families of the lost, the mother who never came home, the firefighter who ran into the building and did not run out, the the child who grew up without a father, hear their loss, described in language that would be inadequate for a traffic accident. Nicholas Harros Jr. lost his mother, Frances, in the towers. She was 76 years old. On the 18th anniversary of the tragedy, he stood at ground zero and said directly to the representative, "Madam, objectively speaking, we know who and what was done. There is no uncertainty about that. Why your confusion?" He was not confused about context. He was not confused about intent. He was asking why the representative chose language that made the worst day of his life sound small. And I believe that question deserves an answer that this body has never required her to give. He turned the page. The second instance, September 2025. Charlie Kirk, a political commentator, a conservative activist, a man with a wife and family, was fatally attacked. In the days following his loss, the representative appeared on the Breaking Points podcast. During that appearance, she made remarks about Mr. Kirk that multiple members of this body, in both parties, characterized as dismissive of his passing and contemptuous of his family's grief. I want to be precise about what I am describing and what I am not describing. I am not describing political criticism of Mr. Kirk's views. Political criticism is protected speech, and vigorous debate is the foundation of this republic. I am describing something different. The demeaning of a deceased person's memory and the belittling of his family's mourning. The representative did not merely make these remarks in a private conversation. She did not merely say them once, in a moment of poor judgment that she later regretted. She appeared on a public platform. She made the remarks deliberately, and then she reposted the interview on her own social media, her verified accounts, with 3.2 million followers amplifying the remarks to a national audience. That is not a slip of the tongue. That is a publication decision. Members, I am not asking you to agree with Charlie Kirk's politics. Half this chamber disagreed with him passionately. That is fine. Disagreement is why this institution exists. But I am asking you whether mocking the violent loss of an American citizen and belittling his family's grief, and then amplifying those remarks to millions of people, reflects creditably on the House of Representatives. The Code of Conduct says at all times, the oath requires me to ask the question. I believe the answer requires no extended deliberation. Johnson turned to the third tab. This section was shorter, deliberately so. He was not relitigating the financial evidence that had been covered extensively in the press and in a separate presidential press conference. He was addressing something more specific and more institutional, the obligation of disclosure itself. Members, the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 requires every member of this House to file annual financial disclosures. These filings are not voluntary, they are a legal obligation directly tied to the office. The purpose is transparency. The principle that the public has a right to know whether their representatives' financial interests conflict with their public duties. The representative's 2023 disclosure listed her household net worth at a maximum of $158,000. Her 2024 disclosure listed it between $6 million and $30 million. Her office has stated that this discrepancy reflects the valuation of her husband's business interests, not her personal wealth. I am not here to investigate the accuracy of those valuations. That is the appropriate work of the Oversight Committee, and Chairman Comer is pursuing it through proper channels. What I am here to address is a separate matter: the disclosure obligation itself. Congressional norms, followed by the overwhelming majority of members in both parties, require that when a spouse holds a significant ownership stake in a company, the member disclose the percentage of that ownership. The representative has not done so. She has reported the total company valuation, $5 million to $25 million for one company, $1 million to $5 million for another, without disclosing her husband as individual share. This omission does not violate the letter of the law. The disclosure forms use ranges, and the Representative S filings are technically compliant with the minimum requirements. But the oath of office does not ask members to meet minimum requirements. It asks them to faithfully discharge the duties of the office. And faithful discharge of duty, in the context of financial disclosure, means providing the public with sufficient information to evaluate potential conflicts of interest. Not the minimum, the sufficient. The Representative S filings provide the minimum. They do not provide the sufficient. And the gap between those two standards, the gap between what the law requires and what the oath demands, is the space in which trust erodes. Johnson turned to the fourth tab. He handled the pages with the particular care of a lawyer approaching the most sensitive section of his argument. The section where precision is most critical, because the stakes are highest. Members, I want to be precise about what I am saying and what I am not saying, because precision matters more in this section than in any other. I am not calling the representative prejudiced. I want that on the record. An accusation of prejudice is a judgment about a person's character, about what they believe in their heart. And I am not in the business of making character judgments from this podium. Character is between a person and their conscience, and ultimately, between a person and their God. I am in a different business. I am in the business of reading records, and the record I am about to read is not ambiguous. He began slowly. 2012. Before she entered Congress, the representative tweeted, "Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel." The use of hypnotized, the image of a Jewish state casting a spell on the world, was identified by the Anti-Defamation League and multiple historians as a direct echo of centuries-old rhetoric about manipulation and control. The representative later called the tweet unfortunate. She did not delete it for several years. January 2019, she entered Congress. Within weeks, she tweeted that American support for Israel was all about the Benjamin's baby, a reference to $100 bills, implying that the sole reason for bipartisan support of Israel was financial. When asked who she meant, she named AIPAC. The implication that Jewish Americans and their organizations purchase political loyalty was condemned by the Democratic leadership. In a joint statement, Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Hoyer, and Whip Clyburn said discriminatory language must be called out, confronted, and condemned whenever it is encountered. Without exception, the representative apologized. She said she was learning about the painful history of discriminatory tropes. February 2019. 3 weeks after that apology. 3 weeks. Members, the representative stated at a Washington bookstore event that she wanted to discuss the political influence in this country that says it is okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country. The accusation of dual loyalty that American Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the United States is one of the oldest, most thoroughly documented, and most dangerous tropes in the historical record. It has been used to justify marginalization, exclusion, and violence against communities for centuries. She did not apologize for the dual loyalty remark. 2023. The House votes 218 to 211 to remove her from the Foreign Affairs Committee. 1 day before the vote. 1 day. She signs a resolution recognizing Israel as a legitimate ally. The timing is observed by members of both parties. A resolution signed 24 hours before a removal vote reads less like a change of heart and more like a legal maneuver. 2024. A second censure resolution, H.A. Res. 1207, is introduced, citing her recent inflammatory comments and history of intolerance. The resolution does not advance to a vote. 2025 and 2026. The pattern continues. The DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, her own political organization, pulls its national endorsement over her Israel-related votes. She is criticized from the left for not being critical enough, and from the center and right for her past prejudiced remarks. She occupies a position in which no political direction offers shelter because the pattern itself, not any single remark, has become the problem. He set the page down. Members, this is a timeline spanning 13 years, 5 separate incidents characterized as discriminatory by members of both parties, multiple apologies, and after each apology, a resumption of the pattern. I want to ask this body a question that is uncomfortable, but necessary. At what point do we conclude that the apologies are performative and the remarks are authentic? At what point do we stop accepting the cycle of offense, apology, repeat, as evidence of growth, and start recognizing it as evidence of a pattern that the apologies cannot break, because they are not intended to break it, but to manage it, to convert each incident from a crisis into a narrative, from an accountability moment into a fundraising moment, from a failure into a survival. The representative has survived every one of these incidents. I have acknowledged that, at the beginning of this address, survival is her particular genius. But survival is not the same as reform. Surviving consequences is not the same as changing the behavior that produced them. And this body, this institution, has to decide whether it will continue to reward survival or begin to demand reform. Because the alternative we have chosen for 7 years, is to accept each apology at face value and then express surprise when the next incident occurs. That is not oversight. That is not accountability. That is institutional amnesia. Conducted in real time, on the public record, before an audience of 330 million Americans who are watching us choose comfort over courage. Johnson closed the 4th tab and set the folder aside. He placed it on the podium, not behind him, not to the side, but directly in front of him, where the camera could see it, and then moved it to the left, making space. What would come next required no folder, no tabs, no evidence. He had memorized this section because it was not about the representative. It was about the institution she served in and the promise she had made to it. The chamber had been quiet throughout, but the quality of the quiet had changed across the 40 minutes of the address, the way the quality of water changes as it gets deeper. At the beginning, the silence had been attentive. Then it had become uncomfortable. Then it had become something else. The silence of people who are being told something they already know but have refused to say, and who recognize, as the telling continues, that the refusal is no longer sustainable. Several members had left during the preceding section, 3 Democrats, at different intervals, through different exits. 2 Republicans had stopped looking at their phones. A senator, who had been observing from the gallery an unusual breach of bicameral protocol that no one had commented on, leaned forward in his seat. Johnson's voice, when he began, was the same voice it had been from the beginning. He did not raise it. He did not lower it. He did not add emphasis or emotion or the kind of theatrical gravity that speakers use when they want an audience to understand that this is the important part. Johnson did not need to signal importance. The oath signals its own importance. All he needed to do was read it. Members, I want to read something aloud. It will take less than a minute. I ask for your full attention, and I believe I will receive it. The chamber was already silent, but the silence deepened. the way a room gets quieter when people stop shifting in their seats and hold still. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. That I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. So help me God. He let the words settle. Every member of this House spoke those words on their first day in this chamber, including the representative from Minnesota's 5th District. Those words are not ceremonial. They are not decorative. They are a contract between the member and the people who elected them, witnessed by the institution and binding in conscience, if not in law. Let me take the oath apart, one clause at a time, against the record we have reviewed today. Support and defend the Constitution. The Constitution protects the right of every American, including Jewish Americans, to participate in political life without being accused of dual loyalty or of purchasing political influence through money. The representative's remarks across 13 years have undermined that principle. Bear true faith and allegiance. Allegiance to the institution includes transparency. The representative's financial disclosures provide the legal minimum while omitting information that congressional norms require. That is not true faith. That is technical compliance. And technical compliance is not the same as allegiance. Well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office. The duties of the office include behaving in a manner that reflects creditably on this House. The representative's public remarks about September 11th, about a tragically deceased American citizen, about Jewish Americans, do not meet that standard. 6 institutional actions in 7 years is the record of a member who has not faithfully discharged her duties. Without mental reservation or purpose of evasion, each apology, followed by a resumption of the pattern, suggests either reservation or evasion. If the apologies were sincere, the pattern would have changed. It has not. He paused. The pause was not for effect. It was the pause of a man arriving at a conclusion he had hoped not to reach. Members, I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana. My father was a firefighter. When I was 12 years old, he responded to an emergency that claimed the life of one of his colleagues. My father survived, but he was critically injured. He carried those scars for the rest of his life. He never complained about them. He never used them for sympathy. And he never, not once, suggested that the oath he took to protect his community was optional or conditional, or subject to revision based on whether it was politically convenient. My father's oath required him to walk into a burning building. The oath of office requires significantly less. It requires members of this House to behave with basic decency, to disclose their finances with basic honesty, to treat their fellow Americans, all of them, with basic respect, and to honor the institution they serve. If that standard is too high for any member of this body, the appropriate response is not to lower the standard. It is to find members for whom the standard is not too high. He looked out across the chamber. The question before this House is not whether the representative violated the code of conduct. The record answers that. The question is not whether the pattern exists. 13 years of documentation answers that. The only question remaining, is whether this institution has the will to enforce its own standards, because if we do not, if we accept the pattern, if we accept the apologies, if we accept the resumption, if we accept another 7 years of the same, then the oath of office is not a contract, it is a suggestion. And if the oath is a suggestion, then this chamber is not the people's house. It is just a room with a very nice carpet and a gavel that nobody uses. He picked up the gavel, held it for a moment, then set it down, gently, precisely. The way a judge sets down a gavel after a verdict that he knows is correct, but takes no pleasure in delivering. I yield the floor. The chamber did not applaud. Applause would have been wrong, would have converted a constitutional argument into a partisan celebration, which was precisely what Johnson had spent 47 minutes avoiding. He had not mentioned Omar's religion. He had not mentioned Somalia. He had not mentioned her hijab or her immigration history, or any of the categories that had been used across 7 years of political combat to both attack and shield her. He had talked about conduct, obligation, and oath. And conduct, obligation, and oath do not require applause. They require action. Instead, there was silence, the particular silence of an institution that has just been told by its own presiding officer that it has been failing, and that recognizes, in the silence, that he is correct. Not all members agreed. Not all members would vote for censure, but the argument had been made on ground that could not be dismissed as partisan, or bigoted, or theatrical, and that ground was now part of the institutional record, permanent and unretractable, the way a court opinion becomes precedent the moment it is filed. 3 Democratic members had left the chamber during the final section. They left separately, at intervals, through different exits, the west door, the east door, and the members' entrance. And none of them spoke to the press pool waiting in Statuary Hall. None of them would explain publicly why they left. But 2 of them were later seen in the Democratic cloakroom, and a colleague who passed through reported that one was sitting alone on a leather couch, staring at the carpet, while the other was on her phone, with a voice that carried just enough to identify 2 words, indefensible and oath. The door closed before the sentence was complete. Omar remained in her seat for the entire duration. She did not leave during the discriminatory rhetoric section. She did not leave during the financial disclosure section. She did not leave during the oath. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine very straight, the posture of a woman who had decided that remaining was itself a statement, that leaving would be surrender, and staying was defiance. But defiance requires an opponent, and Johnson had not been her opponent. He had been her institution's officer, and defiance aimed at your own institution's presiding officer, delivered from a chair in the institution's own chamber, looks less like strength than it does like confirmation of the charge. Her expression was not angry. It was not defeated. It was the expression of a person who is recalculating, running through the toolkit she has used for 7 years, and finding, for the first time, that the tools don't fit the lock. She could not tweet a clapback at the oath of office. She could not fundraise off the House Code of Conduct. She could not convert the Speaker's measured, constitutional argument into a narrative of persecution, because persecution requires a persecutor. And Johnson had been so studiously impersonal, so devoid of animosity, so constitutional in his framing, that the charge of persecution could not attach to him. He had not attacked her. He had audited her, and audits do not produce martyrs. They produce findings. The coverage that followed was shaped less by what Johnson said than by how he said it, or more precisely, by what he did not do. He did not shout. He did not use nicknames. He did not perform outrage, or deliver punchlines, or play to the gallery. He did not mention Omar's religion, her national origin, her immigration history, her hijab, or any of the identity markers that had been weaponized by both sides for different purposes across 7 years of political combat. He talked about conduct, obligation, and the oath of office. And by confining his argument entirely to institutional standards, he made it impossible to dismiss as bigotry. The Wall Street Journal editorial board published a piece titled "The Speaker's Case," It described Johnson's address as the most institutionally serious argument for member accountability since the Ethics Committee proceedings of the 1990s. The piece noted that Johnson had accomplished what no Republican critic of Omar has previously achieved, a critique that cannot be attributed to intolerance because it contains no reference to identity. The Washington Post ran a news analysis, not an opinion piece, a news analysis on the front of the politics section. It observed Johnson deliberately avoided the theatrical approach that characterized President Donald Trump's attacks on Omar earlier this year, opting instead for a constitutional framework that left Democrats with no rhetorical shelter. The piece quoted a Democratic communications strategist who spoke on background. When Trump attacks her, we have a playbook. The playbook is, it's biased, it's intolerant, he's a bully. When the speaker reads the oath of office and asks whether she's honored it, we don't have a playbook for that, because the answer is uncomfortable. The clip that traveled furthest was not a punchline. Johnson had delivered none. It was the oath. The 60 seconds during which the Speaker of the House read the oath of office aloud, slowly, in full, and then mapped each clause against the record he had documented. Viewers who had never read the oath, who had never considered its specific language, who had treated it as ceremonial rather than binding, heard it for the first time as an argument. The effect was like being shown the foundation of a building you had always assumed was decorative. It was not decorative. It was structural, and it was cracked. The firefighter passage, the only personal moment in the 7-minute address, was shared separately, often with no caption. Johnson's father, critically injured in the line of duty, who never complained, who never used his injuries for sympathy, who honored his oath with his body. The contrast with a member of Congress who could not honor hers with her words was implicit, unstated, and devastating. Johnson had mentioned his father once. Once was enough. Hakeem Jeffries did not comment for 48 hours. The Minority Leader's office issued no statement, no tweet, no background, quote, no spokesperson-esque characterization. The silence was total. And in Washington, totalizing, because when the leader of a party declines to defend a member of that party against institutional charges from the opposing party as speaker, the silence functions as a verdict more clearly than any statement could. When Jeffries finally spoke, at an unrelated press conference on education funding 2 days after Johnson's address, he was asked directly whether he believed Omar had violated the House Code of Conduct. His answer was 14 words long. Every member of this body is subject to the same rules and the same standards. He did not say Omar's name. He did not defend her conduct. He did not call the proceedings politically motivated. He affirmed the principle Johnson had articulated, that the rules apply to everyone without contesting the application. In political communication, affirming a principle while declining to defend its most prominent potential violator is the quietest form of abandonment available. The Congressional Black Caucus held a closed-door meeting at which the topic was Omar. The details of the meeting were not leaked. A remarkable feat of discipline in an institution where leaks are as common as committee hearings. A member who attended told The Hill, on background, only this. Nobody defended the Charlie Kirk comments, not one person. Whatever else people felt about the proceedings, that was the line nobody would cross. The implication was that other aspects of Johnson's address, the financial disclosure concerns, the pattern of rhetoric generated internal disagreement. The Charlie Kirk remarks did not. They were indefensible. And the caucus knew it. Even if the caucus would never say so publicly, the Squad, the progressive coalition with which Omar had been most closely identified since entering Congress, issued individual statements. Rashida Tlaib called the proceedings a partisan weaponization of House rules to silence a woman of color who speaks truth to power. Ayanna Pressley defended Omar's right to challenge policy without being subjected to institutional harassment. Neither statement addressed the specific conduct Johnson had described. Neither explained how mocking the violent passing of an American citizen constituted speaking truth to power or challenging policy. Progressive media organizations defended Omar's right to free speech vigorously. They did not defend the content of the speech. The distinction between defending a right and defending its exercise was the gap through which Johnson's argument flowed. He had not challenged her rights. He had challenged her obligations, and obligations, unlike rights, can be enforced by the institution that imposes them. The Ethics Committee announced a preliminary review within 7 days, a timeline that was, by the committee's glacial standards, unprecedented. The committee had been sitting on the flood complaint for months. Johnson's address had not created new evidence. It had created political permission to act on evidence that already existed. The difference between those two things, between evidence and permission, is the difference between a loaded weapon and a pulled trigger. Johnson had pulled the trigger. The committee would determine where the outcome landed. The Oversight Committee, operating on a parallel track, issued a follow-up document request to Tim Mynet's companies, with a response deadline and, for the first time, explicit language noting that non-compliance could result in compulsory process. Compulsory process is Washington's euphemism for subpoena, and its appearance in a letter that previously contained only polite requests marked a shift from inquiry to investigation. H. Res. 713. The censure and committee removal resolution moved from the Rules Committee to the floor schedule. The resolution had been introduced weeks earlier and had been drifting in legislative limbo, not because it lacked Republican votes, but because the political cost of forcing a floor vote on Omar had been judged, until Johnson's address, as higher than the political benefit. Johnson's address inverted that calculus. Two moderate Democrats from competitive suburban districts, both facing 2026 races in which bipartisan credentials mattered, signaled privately that they would vote for committee removal. Their reasoning was identical. After the Speaker's constitutional argument, defending Omar's committee seats was now more politically dangerous than voting to remove them. In Minneapolis, the reaction was both predictable and different. Predictable because the fault line between Omar's supporters and her critics within the Somali American community had been visible since the Trump press conference months earlier. Different because Johnson's address, unlike Trump's, could not be dismissed as bigotry. Trump had attacked with spectacle. Johnson had attacked with the oath, and the oath belongs to the institution, not to a party, or a president, or an ideology. The community organizer named Amina, who had been quoted after Trump's press conference saying, "I believed she was different," and who had become somewhat unwillingly a recurring voice in the story of Omar's accountability, was quoted a third time by the Minnesota Reformer. When the president attacked her, I could say it was political. When her own institution, the institution she swore an oath to, says she violated that oath, I can say the same thing. That's not politics. That's the system working. And if we believe in the system, we have to accept what it says, even when it says something about one of our own. Three primary challengers for the 2026 cycle reported a combined fundraising surge of 340% in the week following Johnson's address. The contributions came overwhelmingly from within the district, small dollar donations averaging $27 from voters who had previously supported Omar. The shift was not from Republican donors seeking to oust a Democrat. It was from Democratic voters seeking to replace a Democrat. That distinction, the difference between external opposition and internal accountability, was the most damaging metric of all. In the Rayburn House office building, in an office on the fourth floor that smelled faintly of the cardamom tea her staff kept in the kitchenette, Ilhan Omar sat at her desk at 9:47 on a Tuesday evening. The office was empty. The staff had gone home at 7:00. The hallway outside was quiet. The particular quiet of a congressional office building after hours, when the only sounds are the ventilation system and the distant footsteps of a Capitol police officer making rounds. On her desk, next to a stack of unopened constituent letters, and a laptop displaying an email she had read 3 times without responding to, there was a laminated card. It was small, the size of a business card, slightly thicker. Every new member of Congress receives one on their first day. It contains the oath of office, printed in small type, laminated in plastic, that is meant to last a career. Omar's card was 7 years old. The lamination was cracked at the corners from handling. The text was faded at the edges from being carried in a purse, in a pocket, in the inside cover of a binder. She had carried it since January 2019. Not as a prop, not as a performance, as a reminder. She picked it up, read it, all of it, slowly. The words she had spoken on her first day in the chamber, the words the speaker had read back to her, to the entire chamber, to the cameras, to the country, 3 days ago. The same words, exactly the same. She set the card face down on the desk. The oath faced the wood. The wood said nothing back. Outside the window, the Capitol dome was lit against the March sky. White and illuminated, and from certain angles, beautiful. From other angles, it was just a building. A very large building with very specific rules, and a gavel that someone, for the first time in 7 years, had decided to use.